Margaret Sullivan was 31 years old, an experienced war correspondent who had covered conflicts in multiple locations before being assigned to Vietnam in 1966. She had reported on American military operations with professionalism and objectivity. She had maintained the distance necessary for credible journalism. But in March 1968, Sullivan submitted an article for publication that would create one of the most significant controversies involving military censorship and press freedom during the Vietnam War. The article was titled, "The Australian Presence, a Different Kind of Soldier." The article described Sullivan's observations of Australian soldiers conducting operations in Phuoc Tuy province. The article was intended for publication in a major American news magazine. The article's most controversial passage appeared approximately halfway through. Sullivan had written, "The Australian soldiers operating in Phuoc Tuy province present a physical appearance that seems almost impossible in the context of a jungle warfare environment. They possess the kind of musculature and physical definition that suggests classical sculpture, rather than contemporary military personnel. Moving through dense jungle terrain, covered in mud and sweat, these soldiers looked like Greek gods descended from Mount Olympus to conduct warfare in Southeast Asia. The contrast between their physical appearance and their operational environment is remarkable." The passage continued. "This physical appearance is not accidental. It results from training methodology that emphasizes functional strength development through progressive environmental stress. The Australian training approach produces soldiers who are not only physically impressive, but also operationally effective. The kill ratios achieved by Australian units and the low casualty rates suggest that the physical conditioning that produces the Greek god appearance is closely correlated with operational effectiveness." Sullivan's article went on to discuss Australian military tactics, Australian equipment, and Australian effectiveness in jungle warfare. But the passage about Australian soldiers looking like Greek gods in the mud would become the focus of controversy. The article was submitted to military censors, as required by military regulations governing press access to operational areas. Military censors reviewed the article with the intention of determining whether the article contained information that would compromise military security or operational effectiveness. The censors identified the passage about Greek gods as problematic. A senior censor named Colonel Edward Mason recommended that the passage be removed from the article before publication. "This passage is inappropriate," Mason stated in his censorship recommendation. "The passage describes military personnel in language that suggests aesthetic appreciation rather than professional military journalism. The passage is not essential to the military information being communicated. The passage should be removed." Sullivan, when informed that the passage was being censored, objected strongly. "The passage is an accurate description of what I observed. I am describing the physical appearance of Australian soldiers and noting the correlation between physical conditioning and operational effectiveness. The passage is factually accurate and relevant to understanding Australian military effectiveness." Mason's response was firm. "The passage describes soldiers in language that is inappropriate for military journalism. The passage suggests aesthetic appreciation of military personnel that is not professional. The passage should be removed." Sullivan refused to allow the passage to be removed. Sullivan argued that the passage was accurate, was relevant, and was protected by press freedom principles. Sullivan refused to submit a version of the article without the passage. The situation escalated. Sullivan's editor at the news magazine was informed of the military's decision to censor the passage. The editor contacted military public affairs leadership to discuss the censorship decision. The military public affairs leadership reviewed the censorship recommendation and agreed with Colonel Mason that the passage was inappropriate. Military leadership decided to enforce the censorship and to prevent publication of the article unless the passage was removed. Sullivan refused to remove the passage. Sullivan contacted lawyers regarding her rights as a press correspondent and regarding military censorship authority. The situation became a legal and political conflict between military authority and press freedom. By April 1968, the situation had attracted attention from press freedom advocates and from journalists throughout Vietnam and in the United States. The question being debated was whether military authority could censor descriptions of military personnel based on aesthetic language used by journalists. Sullivan's position was that she had accurately described what she had observed, and that military censorship of accurate descriptions based on aesthetic language represented inappropriate military control of press freedom. Military leadership's position was that descriptions of military personnel using language suggesting aesthetic appreciation was inappropriate for military journalism, and that such descriptions should be subject to censorship. The disagreement highlighted a fundamental tension between military authority and press freedom. The tension was particularly acute because the passage Sullivan had written was not false or misleading. The passage was an accurate description. The disagreement was about whether the particular way the description was framed was appropriate. After several weeks of negotiation, a compromise was reached. Sullivan agreed to modify the passage to include more explicit discussion of the correlation between physical conditioning and operational effectiveness. Military leadership agreed to allow the modified passage to be published. The modified passage read as follows. The Australian soldiers operating in Phuc Tuy province are physically impressive specimens of military personnel. Their musculature and physical definition result from training methodology that emphasizes functional strength development through environmental stress. The physical conditioning produces soldiers who are operationally effective. Analysis of casualty rates and operational effectiveness suggests that the physical conditioning methods employed by the Australian military produce soldiers who are more effective in jungle warfare than soldiers trained using traditional American physical training methods. The modified passage removed the explicitly aesthetic language about Greek gods, but the modified passage retained the core observation about the correlation between Australian physical conditioning and operational effectiveness. Sullivan's article was eventually published in May 1968. The article received significant attention because of the controversy surrounding the censorship attempt. The article's analysis of Australian military effectiveness was widely cited in military circles. But the censorship controversy had revealed something significant about military attitudes toward press freedom and press coverage of military operations. The controversy revealed that military leadership was willing to censor accurate descriptions of military personnel based on aesthetic language used by journalists. By June 1968, the censorship controversy had attracted attention from press freedom organizations and from journalists throughout the United States. Questions were raised about whether military authority was overreaching in attempting to censor descriptions that were accurate and relevant to understanding military effectiveness. One press freedom organization issued a statement. The military's attempt to censor a journalist's description of military personnel demonstrates the willingness of military authority to control press coverage of military operations. Military authority should be limited to censoring information that would compromise operational security or military effectiveness. Descriptions of military personnel using aesthetic language do not compromise security or effectiveness. Such descriptions should not be subject to censorship. This statement captured the broader perspective of press freedom advocates. Military authority, while legitimate in preventing disclosure of classified information or operational details, should not extend to controlling how journalists described military personnel or military operations. The controversy also attracted attention from female journalists, who viewed the censorship attempt as particularly problematic because it had been imposed on a female journalist's description of male soldiers. One female journalist made an observation that highlighted this dimension. A female journalist describes male soldiers in aesthetic terms and is censored. A male journalist describing female military personnel in similar terms would likely face different treatment. The censorship reveals gender bias in how military leadership views descriptions of military personnel. This observation added another dimension to the censorship controversy. The question of whether military authority could censor aesthetic descriptions of military personnel became intertwined with questions about gender bias in military censorship decisions. By July 1968, the censorship controversy had become less visible as other military and political events dominated attention. But the controversy had left an impact on how press freedom and military authority were understood. The censorship attempt had revealed military leadership's willingness to extend authority to control not just what information was disclosed, but also how military personnel were described. That willingness had challenged fundamental assumptions about press freedom and the limits of military authority. Margaret Sullivan remained in Vietnam for another year after the article was published.
Sullivan continued to report on Australian military operations and American military operations. Sullivan was not subjected to further censorship attempts, although military leadership continued to monitor Sullivan's reporting carefully. When Sullivan returned to the United States in 1969, she had become known as the journalist who had resisted military censorship and who had written about Australian soldiers being like Greek gods in the mud. Sullivan's reputation as a journalist who would challenge military authority and who would resist inappropriate censorship enhanced her credibility. Sullivan was hired by major news organizations as a senior correspondent and continued to cover military and political conflicts for decades. When Sullivan was interviewed about the censorship controversy decades later, she reflected on the significance of what had occurred. The censorship attempt was about more than just a description of soldiers' physical appearance, Sullivan said. The censorship attempt was about military authorities' willingness to control how military operations and military personnel were presented to the public. The military wanted to control not just what information was disclosed, but also how that information was presented. That kind of control is incompatible with press freedom. Sullivan continued. The passage about Greek gods in the mud was accurate. Australian soldiers are physically impressive.
Their physical conditioning is a result of training methodology. The physical conditioning is correlated with operational effectiveness. All of those statements are true. The military censored them not because they were false, but because the military did not like the way they were phrased. That is inappropriate censorship. Sullivan's reflection captured the core issue in the censorship controversy. The question was not whether Sullivan's statements were true. The question was whether military authority could censor true statements based on how those statements were phrased. By the year 2000, the censorship controversy had become a historical case study in discussions of press freedom and military authority. The censorship attempt was cited as an example of military authority overreaching in its control of press coverage. One press freedom organization used the Sullivan case as a teaching example in courses on press freedom and military authority. The Sullivan case demonstrates the importance of limiting military authority to censoring information that actually compromises security or operational effectiveness, the course material stated. Military authority should not extend to controlling how military personnel or military operations are described by journalists. Aesthetic descriptions of military personnel may be inappropriate from military leadership's perspective, but they are protected by press freedom principles and should not be subject to censorship.
The censorship controversy also had implications for how female journalists were treated by military authorities. The controversy revealed that female journalists' descriptions of male soldiers could be censored in ways that might not be applied to male journalists' descriptions. By 1980, the Vietnam War was nearly a decade in the past. The censorship controversy involving Margaret Sullivan had become a historical matter rather than a contemporary issue. But the principles the controversy had raised remained relevant. The slouch hat represented Australian military competence. Sullivan's censored passage about Greek gods in the mud represented something different. It represented military authorities' attempt to control not just information disclosure, but also how military personnel were described to the public. These represented different kinds of Australian influence on American military. The slouch hat influenced tactics and equipment. The censorship controversy influenced discussions about press freedom and military authority. By the year 2010, more than 40 years after Sullivan had written the article, the controversy had become part of military history and media history. The controversy was cited when discussions occurred about the appropriate limits of military censorship and the importance of press freedom. Sullivan lived until 2004. In her final years, she gave interviews reflecting on her career and on the censorship controversy that had been central to her reputation. The phrase, "like Greek gods in the mud," became part of military folklore. The phrase was quoted and referenced whenever discussions occurred about Australian soldiers or about military censorship. The censorship controversy had inadvertently made Sullivan's description more famous than it would have been if there had been no censorship attempt. The censorship attempt had drawn attention to the phrase and had made the phrase memorable. By the year 2020, more than 50 years after the article had been published, the phrase, "like Greek gods in the mud," remained recognizable to those familiar with Vietnam War history and press freedom controversies. The phrase had become iconic because it represented a moment when military authority and press freedom had come into conflict. The phrase had become iconic because it had represented a female journalist's resistance to military censorship. The Australian military, aware of the censorship controversy through military intelligence channels, was amused by the situation. The military censorship had essentially advertised Sullivan's description of Australian soldiers. The censorship attempt had made the description famous. An Australian liaison officer made an observation that captured the Australian perspective. The American military censored the journalist's description of Australian soldiers looking like Greek gods in the mud. The censorship made the description famous. The description became part of military lore. The Australian soldiers became legendary. The military's attempt to suppress the description accomplished the opposite of what was intended. This observation highlighted the ironic consequences of the censorship attempt. By attempting to suppress Sullivan's description, military leadership had ensured that the description became famous and memorable. The censorship controversy had revealed something important about military authority and press freedom. Military authority, in attempting to control how information was presented, could inadvertently increase the salience and memorability of that information. The slouch hat was a visible symbol that was discussed openly. The phrase about Greek gods in the mud was a symbol that had become famous partly because military authorities had attempted to suppress it. Both symbols represented Australian influence on American military in Vietnam. Both symbols persisted long after the Vietnam War had ended. Margaret Sullivan's career was built partly on her reputation as a journalist who had resisted military censorship. Sullivan had become known as someone who would challenge military authority when military authority was overreaching. This reputation had enhanced Sullivan's credibility as a journalist. Sources were more willing to speak to Sullivan because they understood that Sullivan would not allow military authority to suppress information or to control how information was presented. By the time Sullivan retired from journalism in 1995, she had become one of the most respected war correspondents of her generation. Much of that respect derived from her willingness to challenge military authority and to resist military censorship. The censorship controversy involving the phrase "about Greek gods in the mud" had been a formative moment in Sullivan's career. The controversy had demonstrated Sullivan's commitment to press freedom and to resisting military authority when military authority was inappropriate. By the year 2025, the censorship controversy had become part of media history and military history. The controversy was cited whenever discussions occurred about the appropriate limits of military censorship and the importance of protecting press freedom. The phrase, "like Greek gods in the mud," had achieved a kind of immortality through the censorship attempt. The phrase had become famous not because of its literary quality, but because military authority had attempted to suppress it. That suppression had made the phrase memorable and significant. The suppression had ensured that the phrase would be remembered and discussed long after the Vietnam War had ended.
The slouch hat remained a visible symbol of Australian military adaptation. The phrase about Greek gods in the mud remained an invisible symbol of the importance of press freedom and the dangers of military authority overreaching. Both symbols represented Australian influence on American military and on American understanding of military authority and press freedom.